Semnol kake mo faceda.
Stations, a podcast about EVE Online, recorded live on Twitch, Saturdays, 15. I am your host, Matterall. EVE Online is a sci-fi computer game played around the clock by people all over the world. Politics, sovereignty, trade, economics, and war have created a 14-year continuum of history, all created by the players. Today we have a special program featuring Andrew Groen, author of Empires of EVE, a book chronicling the history of nullsec empires of the first decade of the game. We also have two of the biggest names in EVE history, Sir Mole, leader of Band of Brothers, and Celine, founder of Mercenary Coalition. We'll introduce them in just a minute. If you would like to show your support for the show, we'd greatly appreciate follows, subscribe, bits, tips during the show. If you're listening on the podcast, you can contribute through Patreon/Matterall. On behalf of the team, I'd like to thank you for the continued support. Andrew Groen created Empires of EVE, a history of the great wars of EVE Online, a book that he created from scratch. He raised nearly $100,000 himself, arranged for contributors, and managed the process. Years later, the first history book of the rich stories of old empires were preserved for future generations. His latest work is a reading from that book in audio version. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks so much for having me. This is really cool.
Thank you. Sir Mole. Few names ring out through nullsec like the name Sir Mole in the Band of Brothers. Bob, as it's known, was a collection of some of EVE's best players, and Sir Mole was their leader and spokesman. At the core of Bob was Evolution, Sir Mole's corp. In many ways, the game that we play today was shaped in the early days by these players. Long before there were goons. Long before there were any goons in the game, Sir Mole was a champion for Jamel Surum, a Titan pilot for Evolution, and an Empire crusher with a Band of Brothers. For many players, veterans or new players, this is the first time they will hear your voice. Welcome to the show, Sir Mole.
Good morning, ladies.
Celine and fellow mercenaries pioneered the high guns lifestyle of some of the elite alliances today. Mercenary Coalition was the first actual mercenary alliance in EVE and was a fierce enemy that could fight outnumbered and win. Their biggest client was Band of Brothers. They fought together through the Great War and ultimately opposed each other on the field when MC sought to find a home in period basis, the Tortuga campaign. Celine is no common player. Besides being a storied FC, he was a political leader and spokesperson, and a game developer for CCP. He later became a member of the Council of Stellar Management for CSM 6 and 7. Oh, he was chairman of 7. Welcome to the show, Celine.
Hello, everybody.
All right. Well, today we're going to do a walk through history. We have great guests, so we're going to take advantage of every minute we have. So we'll just get right to it and start talking about old Eve and what it used to be like, because the game, as we know, was different back then than it is now. During this show, feel free to write questions inside of chat, and we will try to get to them if we can at the end with a question and answer period. It's going to be a special show, a little bit longer than usual. And before we start, I'd like to thank or introduce Carneros.
Good morning.
Yeah, he's going to be helping me with moderating today. Not moderating, hosting. All right. The first thing I wanted to talk about, it goes to Andrew, and that is Kickstarter. Looks like you had a successful Kickstarter. You got any advice?
I'm not sure if I have actually any advice, except probably the best bit of advice that I do have. Okay, I do have a little bit of advice. If you go on Kickstarter, don't try to make any money, because you won't. Because that's not how, it turns out that's actually not how it works. And also, if you try to make money on Kickstarter, you'll look like a jerk and everyone will hate you. So don't try to make any money. That's my that's my tip. I can go more in depth if you'd like about how to not make any money.
On a serious note, there is a real contrast to be made. I'm not trying to pose, but contrast to be made by the Kickstarter that you proposed and the Kickstarter that was proposed months later through the Mittani.com. That was going to be another historical book, but it was only going to be about the Fountain War, and it was supposed to be the first book of many funded by the station, which is now INN. And it did seem a real contrast in presentation and a real contrast in success and failure. So I thought it was interesting that people would really go beyond your expectations and give you more money than you asked for in order to build it up. What do you think the major difference was?
Well, I think one of the major differences, and I think, the Mittani talked a little bit about this when that whole thing was happening, which was that there was sort of an optics difference, whereas mine kind of started out as this very, very small project. My original goal for the Kickstarter project was like $12,000, because ultimately what I wanted was just to raise enough money to be able to print like 1,000 copies of the book. Like in my head, I was picturing myself like selling these out of the back of a trunk of a car. Like I didn't think that people were actually going to care yet. Like in my mind, the way it was going to work was like, it would be really interesting to get people curious about the project, but it would be really hard to get them to pay money for it. And the reason for that was, one, because I was an outsider in the EVE community at the time, so I had no expectation that the EVE community was going to trust me to do this from the outset, and that I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to convince people before I had written the book who weren't familiar with EVE just how incredible the story actually was. And so I set my sights extremely low, just trying to get the bare minimum off the ground. And it's a better look for Kickstarter. It feels more like what Kickstarter is supposed to be like. And one of the things that the Mittani talked about in sort of the retrospective about that project was sort of the optics of asking for a large sum of money, even if that sum of money is pretty much what you need to pull off a project of that scale. Like writing a book with a professional author, it costs a huge amount of money to be able to actually turn a profit on it. And so some of the things that happened that were mostly in terms of optics, that people really just didn't like the way that it looked, when you really don't want to go to somebody looking flashy when you're asking them for money. And those were just some just sort of optics mistakes. And there's a lot that went on in that project, but it's not my project, so I can't deal too much. I can speak from a fan perspective and a reader perspective, because that was something that I really wanted to happen. I was hopeful that project was going to come through, because like any written project that documents some version or some portion of Eve's history is valuable to someone like me to be able to go back and look at that stuff later on. And even if it's skewed or something like that, you can kind of unskew it by understanding someone's perspective. So the more that we write down, the more valuable it is. And I was kind of disappointed we lost the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great reference. And actually, that one, I wanted to bring this up with you too. Like, there used to be a tradition of historians. Did you rely on their writings much, or were they too biased?
Was that for me?
Yeah.
What kind of historians?
Corporation historians, where they would just
corporation historians are the best. Like corporation historians are like the front line of this stuff. So most of the time when I would find something, like all the early stories of EVE Online, like the stuff that I was reporting from like 2003 or 2004, almost all of them had some kind of like historical anchor in time, because I found like one person's website, or I found like one person's private journal or something like that, or the forum history. Like forum histories, if you've written a forum history, like thank you, I've probably read it. And things like really long wiki histories and stuff like that are what got me into studying EVE in the first place. And so, yeah, people, it's very difficult to write a corporation history because you don't understand the larger context of what's going on around you. But ultimately, like, that's okay. Like, that's someone like mine's job, to come in and combine all the perspectives together. You don't have to feel like just because you don't understand the grand galactic perspective that your perspective isn't important. Like, the more perspectives that you can combine together in the final pastiche of stories is going to be a whole lot better. Like, there's some really awesome moments, I think, in Empires of Eve. Some of my favorite moments in Empires of Eve are just sort of like the ramblings of everyday pilots talking about what it's like to be there at the time. Like, probably my favorite line in Empires of Eve is this I think it was a German guy who kept bouncing around from alliances that kept getting conquered by goons. And he just goes like, there's this one line where he's like, I go to Veritas Immortalis, goon takes my space. I go to, the Northeast, goon takes my space. I go to this next alliance, goon takes my space. And like that sentence, that everyday pilot perspective, like you can't get that anywhere else.
Yeah. That's true. And it adds so much, and I guess it would be better than somebody trying to reach out and figure out what the other side was thinking, because then it's just conjecture. But if you're writing about what you experienced, then that's the actual, first person perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Like nobody understands what the other people are thinking. If you try, you're definitely wrong. So don't try to do that.
Right. Okay. So, you've put together this great book, and we've enjoyed reading it and now listening to it. You're actually a very good presenter as well. So people have seen you in conventions and stuff like that. I imagine there will be more. I mean, you can't just have one of these. Looks like there's lots of room for more.
There's definitely plenty of room for more. There's in my head, like at least 3 other books that I want to write about Eve's history. And like, that's a very conservative number. Like if I was imagining it, there's like 8 or 9 just like lined up next to each other on my bookshelf. Whether or not I'll actually get a chance to do that is another thing. Right now I'm working on a podcast that's like, if you've ever listened to Hardcore History, it's basically the retelling of EVE Online's history in that sort of presenter way that I do at conventions, in a way that's like a little bit more, it's a lot easier to get into than an admittedly pretty dense history book. And so that's my focus right now, is like kind of continuing to proliferate the basic nullsec canon, so that the more and more people can understand exactly how absurd and rich and cool this story is. Like, that's what I want people to know, is the absurd part. Like, people understand it's cool, but they don't understand yet all the weird twists and turns that the history takes that make it worth reading. And that's what I'm trying to get out to people more.
Yeah. And if you listen to the audiobook, which again is great, you're going to miss the little leaflet or these little stories that he puts in the side of a few pages that are really rich. Like, those are great little nuggets of stuff. Like, I remember one with Stain Alliance versus Curse Alliance, and how Stain Alliance wouldn't say anything, so they appeared robotic like the Borg until one day they finally did, and it was do you remember what they said?
Oh yeah. It was this old war back in like 2003 between the old Stain Alliance and the old Curse Alliance, and yeah, it was an old CCPer who was leading Stain Alliance at the time at Limar, a CCP Praetorian, and he was telling me this story about how they developed this strategy within Stain Alliance to just try to appear completely terrifying to the Curse Alliance. And so their strategy was to never say anything. So when they would jump in, they had a complete policy of no chatter in local whatsoever. And if one of their group broke that line, if they started like smack talking in local, whatever, they would shoot down their own ship. They were like completely hardcore about this, just to appear like this like Spartan disciplined force or whatever. And so there's this pitched battle that happens one day, and it's like clearly climactic, and everybody kind of knows it. And Stain Alliance takes the field from Curse Alliance, and the Praetorian comes out, and he's the first person to type in chat in like months, and he just types, "Collect your dead."
Love that.
And everybody goes nuts. And like I've talked to people from Curse Alliance who like remember that years later because it was so impactful that this dude just shows up the first time he ever talks. Collect your dead. Terrifying.
He's an amazing guy. Atli Maur. He's Icelandic. He's platinum blonde, and he speaks perfect English and really, really, really good Chinese and Icelandic, of course. And he's really smart.
Yeah, I remember I talked to him at like 2 a.m. out of their Shanghai office.
Oh, he's down there. Well, you would know Carneros because you worked for CCP as too, along with Celine. So we got some CCPers in here. And I think that one of the funniest parts for me was the response was like, "Are you real?"
I forgot about that.
Curse didn't really know how to approach him, so that I could see them kind of like slinking on, collecting their wreckage and moving off before. But anyway, those stories are delicious. They're in the book. You should get it. And last question about the book. Sure. Do you think, or why was it worth making? Obviously, you think it was worth making.
Why was it worth making? Okay.
Long answer, right?
That's a whole other show. Oh, okay. It's so worth making. Like this was it was honestly the most enlightening experience of my entire life. Like I learned more about reporting. I became a better reporter. I feel like every time I do something new in life, I'm referencing back to like what I learned doing Empires of Eve and what I learned from Eve. And like it's impossible not to feel, even though this is probably a mental delusion, it feels like I can understand like global politics better because I spent 2 years studying diplomatic relations within Eve. That's probably not true, and that's probably not good for me to think, but it does feel that way, and it was worthwhile because it was an incredible learning experience, and honestly because I get to talk to people like at FanFest and stuff like that, and it just sees that it makes them happy, and you know, I know how many copies it sold, and so I expand across the number of copies it sold. I'm like, that's a lot of people who had a nice time with something that I did, and that feels really good, and I'd like to do that again sometime.
Yeah, terrific. And it did do well, right?
Yeah.
Right. So again, check out that book. You can buy it through Amazon. I'll put the link inside a chat. And it's also an audiobook. If you haven't listened to it, it's worth it because it's not just a history book, but it is the living, evolving Eve Online. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Eve was a whole different place back then, but it is the era that built up everything that echoes to this day, as far as mechanics, as far as politics, and as far as philosophy of organization. And so that's what we'll talk about today to some degree. So let's talk about early Eve. And I guess we'll go to Celine and Sir Mole, and probably Sir Mole first. How did you hear about, did people hear about Eve Online?
Well, we were a group back in Homeworld actually back then, and Homeworld was kind of dying and closing down. So we started actively looking for something that fit what we did, and we found EVE Online at that time in beta. So we started planning for just joining EVE Online and starting playing it.
Had your group met up in person during Homeworld days, or did that not come until after you had moved over to EVE Online?
That came after we moved over to EVE Online, and that was by coincidence, more or less. It wasn't anything planned. It just happened, and then it just grew from there. I know what you're referring to. So yes, the barbecue is still on.
But how long had you been in EVE before your first barbecue?
I think the first barbecue was 2004. And I mean, we started EVE before beta. We started EVE in the alpha stages. So that would have been 3 years, maybe 4 years. I'm not sure exactly how long the alpha and beta stages were, but they were long.
Oh, and Celine, when did you hear about EVE?
I was playing a very old game some people might remember called Earth and Beyond with a group of old army buddies. And so there were about 15 or so of us. And I can't remember exactly where I saw the first screenshot of EVE, but it was a picture of a Bantam undocking from one of those big Caldari stations. And the scale of it just seemed so much greater than the cartoony bullshit that you were doing in Earth and Beyond. I'm like, I had to go check this out. And I think I downloaded the beta client after I got approved in like beta 4 or beta 5. And I got folks on the phone, met them at a Pizza Hut, says, okay, everybody has to go download this. We're going to do this now. And that's kind of where I started. And yeah, wrote it on from there. When the actual game went public, I had to actually wait 2 weeks for the Army PX in Germany to get a physical copy of it before I could actually play the game, because they didn't even allow you to download the client back when it first came out.
Now, at that point, you guys, your army buddies, you're not all sitting right next to, you're not all necessarily living in the same country or anything. When was the first time you guys met up in person in RL?
Oh no, actually we were. Most of my buddies were all stationed in Germany at within about 20 or 30 miles of each other. And ironically, it was also our Dungeons and Dragons gaming group. So we've been playing playing together for a little while. But to be honest, I think that out of those dozen or so people that helped get things kicked off in the old days, I'm actually only in contact with about one of them anymore, and that actually still plays EVE. So it's people come and go and so forth. But yeah.
So let's talk about EVE and how it was back then, because it was pretty much it's going to sound interesting, a simplified game compared to what it is now. Some of the things that you could do back then, you didn't have to think about all the exceptions and stuff like that. But can you tell us, let's just go through a few topics here. What were the corporations like when it first started?
Corporations were very simple. I mean, everything was more simplified. If you strip off what you have today, like 90% of it didn't exist. You had very simple mechanics to actually be able to create a corporation and that. So everything you did, if you needed to do something, you needed to do it out of game. You didn't have any in-game mechanics or anything, more or less.
Yeah, and there were no alliances initially, so corporations were your alliance.
Yeah, that was it. And I think they kind of upped it after 6 months. I think the max you could have from the beginning was 50 people, and that was all.
Oh, max 50.
Yep.
So I always want to go back to this, because I think if you're listening to Andrew Groen talk in the audiobook or reading it, you'll find that a lot of fights were 10, 15 people versus 10, 15 people.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, the wars could be a corporation of 20 people, as you say, versus another corporation of 20 people. And if you actually got 40 people on the battlefield, that was massive and enormous.
Yeah, and at the time, it kind of seems like it would still be massive. We're used to these numbers that are just gargantuan now, but compare it to a different raid game or whatever you're fighting, or PvP game. 5-on-5 or 4-on considered a match. And then a big match would be 10 or 12 people fighting each other. And then you get to EVE, and already in 2003, you're talking about more than that.
Well, yeah, I mean, from the betas, the last thing we did in the betas was a massive war, more or less, just within a couple of systems, and everyone in the betas went over to those systems, and we had a massive battle, everyone versus everyone. And I think we topped out at like 100 people, and more or less killed the servers.
Yeah, that was yeah, blew everything up. It was kind of something funny about CCP. They always talked about their technology because it seemed like it really appealed to the people, but it was also showing that they were trying to make this bigger and bigger. They were trying to grow it, and they were trying to give confidence to early players.
Well, the best thing that CCP did was to actually give control to the players, as in the players makes the game, and that is what makes Eve.
Yeah,
I just want to jump in on a couple of things here, especially after Molly's last comment, because I always kind of looked at Eve as being in sort of a kind of a beta stage until sometime around 2008 or so, because there was so much going on, especially in the first couple of years. I mean, one of the reasons that CCP ended up hiring a lot of players to come and work at the company and had a lot of contact with certain players early on was that players were, I mean, in a way, they knew a lot more about what was going on mechanically with the game than the developers did. When you would see exploits, I mean, like a lot of people may have heard of the old Gankageddon, where you would stack 8 heat sinks in the bottoms, and every single one of those heat sinks would apply damage. There were so many things like that that kind of shaped the early days of how conflicts were won or lost, and CCP was constantly trying to keep up with the next crazy shit that players figured out and try to patch it or fix it, or or make it better. And one of the things that Molly mentioned about the last day of beta, there was also a transition in 2005 or 2006 whenever they changed their entire server architecture, and they literally had like an Armageddon day or something where the old servers were left on for like an extra night, and everybody was able to just go absolutely berserk. There were carriers in Jita, and everybody was just going bananas for about a whole night before they switched everybody to the other servers. So it was a very different time, a very different type of CCP as well.
Yeah, I do like that point you made, that the players and the devs kind of seem in it together, because the players knew just as much as the devs did. And if you think about it, at the 10th anniversary of CCP, they were up there. Hilmar was up there talking, or somebody else was up there talking, saying like, these players were telling us about our game more information than we had. So they hired him, and this is early on before they actually constructed the betas and alphas. So some of the devs were coming right out of the community, even to begin with. I think Hilmar came out that way. He was the one that knew a lot than they did, something like that. But both of you are leaders of significant organizations that historically have left their mark in a major way, and you were both FCs. So what was combat like, and what was FCing like back then?
Whoever could coordinate best would win. That's just it. If you had out-of-game voice communications and you had a tight team and you went up versus one who didn't, you would win. So that was basically it. Crazy setups and stuff? No. I mean, a battleship was a battleship. Yeah, you could stack heat sinks like Salim was saying, and the Gankageddons, everyone knew what that was. But we didn't have crazy tactics like you have today, as in whatever you're taking the flavor of the month, and we're all doing hacks. We have armor hacks, we have shield carriers. We didn't have that. We took everything there was, one battleship of each, and divided it up. We didn't have the specialized tactics that you have today, so that was majorly different.
Yeah, the absolute biggest thing is that what Molly said at the very first was voice comms, especially in the first 2 or 3 years. It is amazing the number of people that were playing Eve that didn't have a TS server or even Ventrilo. There's an old word, and yeah, and and CCP did attempt to kind of integrate their own thing called eVoice into the game to kind of compensate for that, but it never caught on. But being able to change things up on the fly was a foreign concept to a lot of people that were playing the game back then. So if you could have actual voice comms, and fleet compositions didn't matter so much very early on because there were so few different types of, if you had battleships, you had heavy assault cruisers, you were already so far ahead of what your enemies were using that it almost didn't matter if you were flying a shield or an armor comp, or even if you had Logi or not, because you were so overpowering that it was almost a moot point. So it took a few years for those type of things to actually start mattering.
One thing that actually did matter a lot, though, was actually your skill points. I remember when we were doing the Northern Wars, whatever iteration it was, we had something called Duramaulers. I don't know if you remember those. So basically a cruiser which could not be hit by a battleship or a cruiser. And it only worked if you were at the top of your skill level, as in you started when EVE was released and you had managed to train up your skills to the maximum and the proper direction, then you could actually get into these ships and do what we call Duramaulers. Nothing could hit it and you could kill anything.
They're called Duramaulers?
Yep, Duramaulers.
Mm. There was also some craziness with putting siege missiles on Kestrels.
No, that was actually just a normal thing back then. I mean, you used to be able, the first 2 or 3 years of the game, putting torpedoes on Blackbirds or cruise missile launchers onto Kestrels and things like that, or even cruise missile launchers on Rifters. That was absolutely hilarious. And then that kind of went into the other big meta was being able to dual prop mod. And I don't mean AB and MWD. I mean putting 2 MWDs on like Ruptures and Ravens, and then that's the old cavalry Raven thing where you could literally just put like cruise missile launchers on Ravens and you would fly by the target before the cruise missiles even hit. It was hilarious.
Yeah. And what was the ship of choice?
APOC.
Yeah.
Apocalypse battleship. Okay. By the way, I found out that the first battleship to run off assembly lines was Dominic's, even though the Apocalypse.
It was the cheapest.
Probably why it got made first, I guess. Less minerals. Speaking of FCing, my FC of choice, Vince Draken, says back in more often, Sir Mole. You're still around. You're in NC Dot, right?
Yeah, I'm in NC Dot. I'm kind of in a grandpa role, though, so I'm not actively in battles or stuff like that, at least not the last couple of years. But yeah, I'm still around.
Yeah. Actually, I think I flew in your last because I was like, he did FC one time. I was in a fleet, and I looked it up, and it was a pause kill in Iridia, and I was on that fleet. It was a short little thing.
Okay, yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah. But that was my first and only fleet with you as FC, which is really a treat. Okay, let's talk about... Oh, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
No, I'm good. I'm just laughing at what you're saying.
I did want to throw one other thing in here that I made in the stream, which is that I think another reason that the Dominic's was put out there first was because it could use like 20 or 30 mining drones. So that might have had something to do with it as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
The race for minerals was just insane back then because you had to have the minerals to build it because this shit wasn't on the market. You had to mine the shit yourself.
Yeah, so you were a fighter by night and a miner by day kind of thing, right?
And the amount of mining traps that we have set up are numerous.
Mm.
You put in a bunch of people in a build and put one miner on the ship and the rest guns, and then you fake a mining op and get people to attack you.
Yeah. So the other thing that was different back then, that might have been different, of course, the whole pageantry of EVE Online seemed different. And Andrew talks about this when he does his speeches really well. Was just the way that it was presented. But before we talk about that, the metagame, like Evolution, your corporation, seemed to just not only be more skilled and more organized, but you seem to kind of pioneer subterfuge as well. Was that a big part of your situation, or did that develop later?
It wasn't really. I mean, yeah, we had a good PR section of the corporation. We had people who were actually good at exploiting whatever happened and turn it into our advantage. But we did not really plan the stuff beforehand until way, way, way later, as in, okay, we want this to happen and we're going to do this to make this happen. But in the beginning, no, we didn't really have that much of a subterfuge. It was more, okay, this happened. How can we exploit that?
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to talk about the pageantry of Eve and how expressive the forums were and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's an entirely different world that people who started playing Eve, if you started playing Eve like as much as like 8 years ago, you still wouldn't recognize the way that Eve looked in like 2003, 2004, and even 05, 06. Because the tradition, in the same way that you know, in modern Eve, you're supposed to be kind of like very blue collar, very like jokey, and not take things too seriously in most cases, is generally the way that people like to carry themselves. In this era of Eve, if you weren't role playing, you were just nobody. You know, like if you weren't someone who could command attention on the forums, then no one was really paying attention to you. And I really find that extremely fascinating because part of it clearly to me has to do with the infrastructure of the internet. You know, that's how you talked to people at the time, was on the forums. So if you're going to talk to people on the forums, it better be entertaining. And if you're just going to be sort of like aloof, no one's going to bother reading all of your posts every single time. But if you're going to be entertaining, if you're going to be, you know, the space dictator or the space propagandist, even if you hate that person, you're still going to read what they have to say. And so a lot of the most prominent personalities at the time projected their character onto the diplomatic relations of everything that was going on. And that set sort of a culture where if you wanted to speak publicly, it was sort of expected that you do so. And it kind of created a more literal space opera than we have today in modern Eve, where we still have that storyline developing because it started it's rooted in that original storyline. But back then, it wasn't just like a space opera. It actually like basically was, because the people in it were pretending that it was. They were making it real and then having the actual battles. Only the actual battles were politically motivated. Like they sort of will it into reality in a very weird and unique way. And that's one of my favorite things about the era of Eve that Empires of Eve covers, is that everybody's just having so much fun with it. Like it's infectious, just how much fun everyone's having with just the day-to-day of what's going on.
Yeah, I think Sir Mole's his signature was the clock, right? There always seemed to be a tick-tock.
The pendulum.
The pendulum.
That was part of the pendulum campaign, so that was way back.
Yeah. The pendulum, was that a grandfather clock pendulum kind of thing?
Yeah, that's where all the myths started about. It was all planned at the barbecue, because that one was actually planned at the barbecue.
So that one was planned at the barbecue. So you planned world domination at a barbecue that you would have every year. Legend or true?
It's totally true, because the first barbecue we had, there was like 7 people, and that was just people coming from all over the world over to Denmark having fun. The second one and the third one, I think at the third one, we started actually doing a strategy session where we actually had a whiteboard and everything and maps, and just did strategy for a couple of hours, asking what can we do, what should we do, why should we do it, and then just plan out the events. And the first thing we did plan on the barbecue was the Pendulum Wars.
Well, see, it may be true, but it is also legendary. The barbecues are legendary at this point.
Yeah, I know.
Well, so this is before meetups and stuff.
Yeah, this is before meetups. I mean, the barbecue started way before CCP did any kind of meetups. I think they started, was it 2008 or 9? I'm not sure when they started. But the first one we had was like, as I told you, 8 people or 7 people. The second we had was like 50 people. And then it just spiraled from there. The most we had was about 250 people coming over, staying for a week in tents, and we rented a camp, etc., and just had a blast.
In those days, imagine telling your mom or dad that you're flying to Denmark to meet a bunch of people you know over the internet, and you've never met them in person. That was a different era. Your parents would have looked at you like you were, playing Russian roulette or something.
Yeah, absolutely. There was like that's something that I found really interesting about the barbecue, and it's because that was, like you said, it was a completely different era, and nobody did stuff like that back then. Like the things that you did online, regardless of what it was, like even if it was just playing video games, you were supposed to basically, culturally, you were supposed to be embarrassed about it, right? Like you're supposed to pretend that you didn't have an online life because anything that you did on the internet was nerdy. And it took a lot of these people to plan in-person events. If people hadn't done that, that culture might not have actually broken down. And nowadays, everybody gets it. Like if you go and meet all your internet friends, it's awesome, and you should definitely go do that. But people didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, and so how do you still have those barbecues?
Yes, I do. I think we're coming up on 15 years soon.
Oh wow! And how big are they these days? Is it just your old friends?
These days they're smaller. I'm not inviting all of Eve. I'm just inviting parts of Evolution and the Evolution guys and old friends. So they're coming over to my house and they're staying at my house, and it's usually a weekend only, and it's coming up next weekend.
Oh wow! So next weekend. Great. It's a great tradition. Yeah. So the motivations, like both of you guys are leaders. What's it like to get people to try to do stuff, especially like in this game? What were some of the things that people were motivated by?
You can get people to do anything whatsoever. I mean, but at Evolution, we got the most people when we called for a mining op.
So mining was a big draw.
Well, we made it fun. We had fun on our voice comms. We entertained ourselves. We had more or less what you have now, music broadcasts and stuff like that. And the girls in Evolution would come and play around with the guys in Evolution and just having a blast. So, yeah, that was an event. As a mining up, okay, let's go, everyone. Screw the mining. We're going to have fun.
Well, it sounds like people just wanted to hang out.
Yeah, that was basically it.
Yeah,
Celine?
that was being able to get a group of people online and keep them entertained for 2 or 3 hours at a time was definitely one of the bigger skills as a quote unquote FC, whether you were FCing a mining op or whether you were going off on a drunken rampage, out in the cosmos. It was not people. I find that today in EVE, people often expect to just kind of log in and the content will be there waiting on them, and all they have to do is undock and go. And when you only had 6,000 people online a night, or you had to actually go looking for it. So in between sitting on a gate or cleaning out a belt, you had to be able to actually keep people entertained. So it helped if everybody was kind of familiar with each other because they knew each other from meeting, or that they spent a lot of time hanging out on comms talking to each other. So it wasn't quite as, I'd say, militaristic as it is in some aspects today. It was a lot more social in the early days.
It was both things, I would say, though, because you had two different modes back then. You had the bullshit mode when everyone was having fun, and then you would switch in an instant because, okay, now we need to do shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it actually sounds like a smaller deal as well. You have 20, 40 guys that kind of all know each other. Whereas now, the leaders of alliances, there are a lot of people in their group that they don't even know. So I wonder if it's a bit different now, where you have to kind of, a bunch of people that you're not actually friends with.
It's kind of the same thing. It's just a different scale. I mean, any FC will tell you that FCing for a longer period of time is like herding cats. You got to keep everyone in control. You got to keep them entertained, and you got to get them to stay. If you as an FC cannot do that, you're going to fail as an FC.
Right. So the broader perspective now, the game, there were different philosophies at work. Andrew, maybe you can talk about this and you guys can jump in.
Sure.
What was going on with philosophies about space? Like it seemed that I ran into a story where somebody was flying through nullsec and he was stopped by someone who said, "Turn back, you can't go this way." And I just thought that was utterly ridiculous in today's world. But back then,
Yeah.
it was different, right? What were the different philosophies at work there?
Yeah, and I mean, it's always a little bit wishy-washy when you talk about philosophies, because philosophies are sort of like inherently ephemeral. Like there's not a whole lot of historical contexts or like data points that you can back up a lot of this stuff. But when you talk to people back then, particularly like when I talked to Jade Constantine, they're convinced that like the epic struggle, the primordial struggle at the time in Eve, and honestly, it's kind of been the struggle with Eve for, with nullsec forever, it can be essentially boiled down to like the struggle between NRDS and yeah, basically. So
not red, don't shoot.
And
if not blue or something, shoot. Somebody correct me on that.
So
not blue, shoot it.
Not blue, shoot it. So basically, it was a conflict between the people who were sort of instinctively going out into nullsec, conquering a group of star systems, and then militarily blocking off those star systems, which was really hard to do back then because there was no sovereignty in 2003. That didn't come in until I think like mid 2004 or something like that. And so you would just go in, you'd be the toughest guys around, and you'd take over a star system, a group of star systems, and it would be yours. Some other people at the time, a lot of other people at the time, actually, because you had both Jade Constantine and the Venal Alliance, but you also had the Coalition of Free Stars in the southwest at the time, down in Aquarius and Period bases. And there was basically this struggle between democracies who wanted to like let people into their territory and participate in what they were doing and have open borders, and then there was people who didn't want to have open borders. And those were sort of the central philosophical arguments that were going on at the time, because there were some people who didn't necessarily believe that Eve was destined to become this sort of like militaristic hellscape out in nullsec. Like there was some people who thought that it could be just like a place of like peace and trading and building. And you see this idea kind of crop up a few different times, like later on in like 2006, Ascendant Frontier kind of like has a similar thing going on where they're more focused on building than they are destroying. And I think that's kind of the central dynamic in nullsec, right? It's builders versus shooters, at least in the early few years.
Yeah. Well, it just seems like we live in a certain society in EVE Online that is taken for. If you go to nullsec, you kill everything unless it's blue. You just do. Except in certain areas where people try to preserve, if let somebody pass if you want to. There's also now a whole philosophy, signal cartel of don't shoot first. We're just explorers, don't attack anybody. But if you're attacked, then fight back. And it seemed like that was more back then. Like it wasn't a given that you would just kill everybody that you saw in nullsec space. There was a thing of
definitely
right. Like exploring, letting people pass through, and
yeah, I mean, killing somebody in early Eve was like kind of a risk. It seemed like, and Molly can speak more to this than I can, but to me it seemed like it was kind of a risk because there really weren't that many people around. And so if you did something wrong, people were going to hear about it. And if you were labeled a pirate back then, this was like this really big deal. Like it was like you would really try to deny that. If someone labeled you a pirate, you'd be like, whoa.
It's like being called a racist or something.
Whoa. Let's talk this through. Let's not just hurl expletives around here, Yeah. And so like you want to be careful with that, because it was, I guess it would kind of be roughly analogous to being like a scam artist nowadays. People, once you're outed as a scam artist, once you've soiled your reputation, nobody trusts you anymore. You weren't like persona non grata as a pirate, although you were in some nullsec territories. But yeah. Your reputation was forfeit.
being a pirate was a very bad thing. Yes, and yeah, you got a couple of people around that were pirates, and the most infamous ones at that time is what became Moo. And they were pirates. They were self-declared pirates, and they were bad, naughty people, and they would look at you and you would blow up.
That was Masters of Onage. Celine?
Yeah, it Molly beat me to the punch because there were a few groups like Moo, like Space Invaders, a couple others that they reveled in that reputation, and the outsized effect that sort of thing had on people dealing with you was just phenomenal. Andrew touched on, what I guess could be called the forum wars at the time. If you were well spoken and presented yourself well, or if you made a couple of really cool videos, because there weren't a lot of videos going around. If you made a couple of cool videos of your pirate group blowing the shit out of everybody, then it would magnify so much. And that's kind of, it goes back to when you guys were talking about the barbecue earlier, when the whole pendulum thing got announced, and Band of Brothers essentially stated that their stated goal was to take over the entire map. There were so many people that were like, "Oh, that's crazy! That's crazy!" But when you think about it, what's the point of playing a game like this if that isn't your ultimate goal in a way? Is to win everything. But just the fact that there were people that were playing this game that were willing to even make those statements unapologetically would go very far into how people would perceive or react to you, and it's a lot of fun.
I get a sense that the early days were nobody knew how to act because Eve wasn't evolved. It wasn't created, and there wasn't this history that was there. So people were taking their influences from the world. They had statesmen, they had spokesmen, they had military generals, and they were kind of role-playing real life in this virtual world, because that's kind of what their modeling was. And so then a lot of the courtesies of just don't shoot somebody in the street kind of seemed to be the norm. But again, if you put it in context of what other games were doing at the time, you did, if you played Star Wars Galaxy, for instance, you didn't just shoot everybody who was walking by, running around and stuff. You would just let them kind of go along their way. But I thought that was very interesting, and how it's changed considerably, especially in Null. All right, let's start talking about some major you were a part of. Starting off with the first major war in Eve. Andrew, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's. I hesitate to call it the first major war. Stain versus Curse is like what people consider to be the first, I think, major war, but I don't really know very much about that for very complex reasons. But you're talking about the Venal Alliance up in the north,
right? That led to the war against Phoenix Alliance.
Cool. So yeah, like the first war that I feel like was the stone dropping in the pond, and we're still kind of watching the ripple effects, was like in 2003, where there's this organization called the Venal Alliance up in the north, and there's like two factions within the Venal Alliance, and there's the free space loving Jade Constantine and Jericho faction, and then there's the the staunch libertarian wing, Taggart Transdimensional. And basically what happens is Evolution hates Taggart Transdimensional, goes to invade the Venal Alliance, and goes through really elaborate means to kind of like try to drive a wedge between the Alliance to split those two factions apart. And that sort of the fallout from that, because it's successful, and it leads to this sort of very brutal civil war up in the north, especially for the early years. Like this is one of the most brutal things that's happening in EVE Online at the time. Ends up sparking a lot of different things that come after that, and ends up creating the beginning conditions for the Great Northern War, which came after that. And then in the Great Northern War, Band of Brothers is formed for the first time, and then the next 4 years of history all revolve around Band of Brothers. And so it's really fascinating to look at this early event, where this early civil war, and see there's a footprint here, and if you follow that footprint, it leads you to some really, really interesting places, and you can continue following it all the way up to modern day. And that's one of the things that really drives me about Eve.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Sir Molly, why did you hate Taggart?
Okay, so this came from the beta games actually. So before Eve was released, Taggart was this huge, humongous corporation in the betas that were trying to do whatever they felt like, and we were the evil little corporation that came in, and we were going to show them that no, you cannot do what you want to do. So it just became natural that we became enemies, and it just spiraled from there, really. I mean, the philosophies of Taggart and how they were playing, it didn't sit well with us and the way we were playing, so we were just natural enemies, and it came from the betas.
Oh, is it just now? Did you always have the communist kind of model in mind? Because evolution is like a communist. By communist, I mean communal, where everything belongs to the model.
Yeah. So, I mean, we played the betas. The betas reset everything like 10 or 20 times. You play for 3 months, and then we're going to start from scratch again. And then you play for 3 months, and you're going to start from scratch again. After doing that a couple of times, we figured out, okay, what is the best way to actually advance and make progress? And since we were such a tight group in the beginning, we were like 20, 30 people at the most. Everyone knew each other, everyone trusted each other. So every single person within Evolution was a director in the corporation. So that meant we took no invites. We didn't take any people into the corporation unless we knew them very, very well. So sharing everything and working towards everyone's goal instead of one person's goal, that was just natural.
Mm-hmm. And do you practice that to this day, or have things changed?
No, we practice that to this day. Evolution is still what you call a communistic corp, as in the corp owns everything and the pilot owes nothing. So we give the pilot whatever they need, and the pilot gives back whatever they can to the corporation.
Oh, whatever they can.
Yeah. It's not, okay, you got to give me 50 billions this month because that's your share. No, you're going to give whatever you can afford with your playing time. If you have 5 hours to play, okay, have fun, play 5 hours. If you're playing 50 hours and making a ton of stuff on the side, okay, contribute to Evolution. We're not, I'm not sure how to put it, but we're not anal about it. So it's not, if someone goes out and makes 100 mil on the side because they wanted to buy themselves shiny shoes, we're not going to get pissed about that. But overall, yes, we are in a communistic corporation.
And so that was maybe in contrast to Taggart, which was, put it, more Ayn Rand based or more libertarian.
Yeah, that they were totally capitalistic, as in they were playing for their own gains while we were playing for the group's gains.
Yeah, so already you're seeing like a crash of styles. Okay, so you went and attacked them, and I guess that evolved into. I mean, Jade Constantine was involved. This is all in the book if you want to read it. It's done very well by Andrew. I recommend it. And then that turned into, eventually evolved into Phoenix Alliance, sitting up there. And what was did you have a motivation for fighting Phoenix?
The motivation for fighting was fighting to getting fights. I mean, that was it.
Simple as that, right? But they were also a big target, I guess.
Yeah. So from the betas, when we started, we were always viewed as a small elite corporation. And we wanted to take that image and show them, hey, give us your biggest, baddest guy, whatever you have, throw it at us, and we're going to crunch it.
So it was a challenge.
We were going for, I don't know, what do you want to call it? The bully or whatever, the big bad guy on the corner.
Mm-hmm. So when you did attack them, there was this huge fight, lasted even other alliances from down south were getting in. It ends up, what's that? It ends up in a tie, or what's it, armistice agreement, where you basically both decide, yeah, we'll stop fighting. What happened there? Why didn't anybody like really win by taking over territory or crushing their enemy that time?
At that time, you couldn't take territory. You couldn't crush people. You could control the space while you're awake and flying in space. When you have docked and gone to bed, you can no longer control space. It wasn't possible to win without actually getting so much pressure on your enemy so that your enemy implodes. That was the only way to win. There was no way to control anything else. Nowadays, you have a lot of mechanics to be able to actually control space and say, hey, this is our space. Look here, we've got a mark on the map that says this is our space. That didn't exist back then.
And you can now destroy people's bases, right? Back then, you couldn't?
You couldn't kill a station. You couldn't, I mean, POSs didn't really exist. You could blow up their ships. The first couple of years, the way to hide a ship in space was to park it at a deep safe. That's what you did. You went to a deep safe spot, parked your ship, ejected, so you would have a ship in space, and then you go dock. So you would actually have parking depots out in deep space with 20 ships sitting without pilots.
Can you imagine stumbling upon this? Were there any probe mechanics that could find them?
In the beginning, no. There was more or less just manual warping in a direction where you could do a directional scan towards where they were. We had a couple of people who were actually doing that. I said, okay, we'll figure out what direction they are, and we're going to warp in that direction, turn off our warp and see if we land close. And then we're going to slingshot off each other and keep trying to go to where their safe spot is with their ships manually, without any probes whatsoever.
Wow. Right,
That's crazy.
Yeah. When that war wraps up, were there any like lessons that you took away from that? Did it put you in a different position or different mindset? Or were you just thinking?
I think I missed half of what you said right there.
When the war was over, what was the after effects of? Did you say, okay, what's next on the menu, kind of thing, or?
Well, the wars kind of ended up there when they started introducing player-owned stations and outposts, and you can actually take stations, and we fought over the same station like 20 times, every time a downtime or less. Okay, let's take it, let's lose it, let's take it, let's lose it. That got old after a while, so eventually we kind of just settled down and said, okay, what are we going to do now? And that's kind of when we decided, okay, we're done with the north now, let's go down south.
Yeah.
Quick question real quick.
Yeah.
Well, Mole, you mentioned that there was this focus in early Eve, not on militarily dominating people because it was impossible, but trying to like kind of crack them internally and sort of break the group. And that became kind of a time-honored tradition in Eve. Like if you're in a war in modern Eve and you're not trying to do that, at least like you're not using all the tools in your toolkit. Do you think that maybe Eve might have progressed in a different direction had it not been kind of mandatory to try to do that in the early wars?
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure if it's me breaking up or if it's you there, Andrew, but I did not get that part.
I'll try one more time. Do you think that Eve would have progressed in a different direction if you didn't have to, in the early days, focus on breaking people internally? Since you said there was no military way to do it, you had to focus on breaking them internally. Do you think Eve would have progressed in a different direction away from sort of like spies and subterfuge if you didn't have to do that in the early days?
It became a very big part of what you had to do to be able to break someone. You had to get someone on the inside. You had to try and break it from the inside. I mean, if the mechanics would have been there for actually being able to create a victory and say, yes, we won, then that part wouldn't have been that big piece of Eve as it is today, I would say.
Okay, so Stain and Cursed, I want to turn your attention to the south. Stain and Cursed were in some kind of a eternal war for like 2 years where they're fighting back and forth. Celine, were you a part of that conflict, or did you come in a little later?
I was there kind of when it really initially kicked off. I had actually moved my little corporation out to Curse, and we actually formed a small little coalition of folks that went to war against Curse Alliance, what was beginning to be Curse Alliance, and they were Curse Alliance simply because they lived in Curse. And we came out on the bad end of that against corporations like Vengeance of the Fallen and a few other ones. And so we started talking to and moved over to Stain and joined the Stain Alliance. And, you know, and Curse and Stain were right next to each other. And if you look at the map even today, there's this, you know, one long couple of jumps that connects the two regions. And basically, they went to war with each other simply because it was something to do. There was none of the, I don't ever recall there being any of the high-minded ideology. It was just simply that Curse were the bad guys and Stain were the good guys. And that is correct, by the way. I just want to make that clear. And they
I
just
checked the sources.
yeah. And, you know, and it just went back and forth for, a better part of a year and a half. And it started basically the same way that Mully was describing what was going on in the North. He just pounded and pounded and pounded. And I mean, and one other thing, there were no kill mails initially in Eve. So for the first year or more, there was no way to even verify who was actually winning or losing a conflict. There were no kill mails. There were no kill boards. There was constant arguing about, you know, who was winning or losing a conflict on the forums. And so you would sometimes have to judge who was winning a conflict basically by the command of whoever had the greatest command of the English language on the forums. And so, you know, up until a certain point, there was no way to even just, you know, to figure out what was going on in some of these conflicts. And then eventually kill mails did come in, conquerable stations came in, and then you had a bit more, you know, bragging rights or way to, you know, kind of show what the results of, you know, your weekend of not sleeping was about. But it just, I kind of stepped out of all of that sometime around late 2004, because it just the back and forth with no real pointable goals, you know, and something you say, oh, look what we did, you know, it kind of got to wearing on me, and then I kind of went off to do my own thing, and that's a whole other story. But it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
Well, it seems like you were fighting for the excitement of the fight, and sometimes with kill mails, it's fighting collection of treasure. You know, look at how many kills I have. I go on and on about this, but it seems like kill mails and the APIs and all the stuff that gives you statistics is a real driving force for some people. But it creates really odd behavior with people just shooting one shot into 5 different ships so they get credit for, or not flying logistics because you don't get counted when you do that. And
no doubt, it's definitely changed. Like I would say the meta of why certain people fly, but back then it was just, as I said, if you found a group of people, because as I said earlier, sometimes there were nights where, you know, you didn't even have 10,000 people online. It took a while for Eve to really take off, you know, after the first 2 or 3 years. So if you found a group that you could get steady content from, then you kind of tended to stay in that area, so that way you could, you know, kind of be guaranteed of having a reason to log in and fight if that was your primary goal. If all you want to do is, you know, mine away, you know, you could do that, and, you know, maybe no one would bother you. But if your primary goal was to fight someone, you either had to go looking for a war or go to a place where you knew there was a war going on. And the Stain Alliance and the Curse Alliance thing was probably one of the more consistent conflicts in the early years of Eve. If you wanted to fight, you could go join either side and know that you were probably going to be able to shoot somebody at some point.
It was a red versus blue of its time, I guess.
Pretty much, yeah.
No, so who came out of Stain Alliance? What groups that grew came from that area?
I would say that probably historically the most well-known group that got to be pretty big would be, I believe there was a Tyrell Corporation, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure Celestial Horizon came out of Stain Alliance, and they were the core of you know, that was Sivok and Zedek, Zedek Alliance, and then that eventually became Ascended Frontier.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about them in a minute. Also, you had Red Alliance and the kind of the Russian players.
Yeah, they were the
starting
bad
out.
guy. They were in Curse around.
They're the bad guys.
Well, actually, they weren't even in Curse. They were just kind of their own thing. They would just show up sometimes and be mean to everybody and go back to their little holes.
There was, and out of that group, you had big names like Mac Tech, I guess UX Dad. You had Evil Thug, started AAA.
Oh yeah, my buddy.
All those guys were were there. What does that name mean to you, Sir Mo?
No, it's just those old names. It's like MacTep's been around forever. I'm not sure if he's still actually around.
He is. He just flew in the Alliance tournament, actually.
Oh God. Oh God. And it's like Evil Thug. He's such a great guy. He is such a great guy. And those old school guys and everything that came with him, like Evil Thug, this stern Russian that's never going to give up no matter what. He's going to be in your face. I think Celine can testify to that.
Oh yeah.
You don't have these guys anymore. They don't exist. It's good old profiles. I'm sorry, but it was way better before Eve evolved above a certain level. So the personas that you had back then, you're never going to get those back.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you had Foil and Zertam both on the Curse Alliance side, who are some of the only names that you can still hear from 2003. And the sort of apocryphal story about them is they just screamed at each other like twice a week in council meetings. Like there was just this civil war happening like inside of the Alliance, but they refused to break apart, so they would just scream at each other trying to dominate one another in these council meetings. And then on Stain Alliance side, you had Trigger, who is a huge character, a huge role player, who I believe someone told me once, like, always talk to people sort of like a drill sergeant. And so he'd be like, come into a chat channel. I'd be like, what's going on, maggots? How's everybody doing today, maggots?
That is 100% correct. Until you get to know Trigger, because Trigger, when he's off role, is a totally different person. I mean,
Sure.
Evolution worked a lot with Mass back then when we were involved within the CA and SA wars. And Mass was the driving force behind the State Alliance, and Trigger was the driving force of the whole alliance.
Right. There's examples of where somebody would say, hey, there's battleships on the other side of that gate. And the Russian guy would say, yeah, I count 20. Ready to go? No question. Let's go. There's only 2 of us. Doesn't matter. Let's go. And I talked to Sort Dragon at one point, and he said that was kind of what happened in BTAC-R, the biggest fight where these Titans all collided and killed 75, 80 Titans or more. And it was the Russians that were like, what are we waiting for? Let's get in there. That's kind of what started the actual fight, but I don't know. By the way, I did hear Zertram has passed away, unfortunately, the other day, or not the other day, but
I think that was a few years back, actually.
Yeah, I just heard that from somebody else. Okay, so that was Curse and Stained. Out of there came Arcane Technologies, which was ATUC. Can you guys tell us a little bit about that corporation? If not, I will.
ATUC came out of, if you say Stain Alliance, I'm going to take your word for it.
No, it was Cursed. Well, both, because they switched sides.
Yeah. So ATUC is, that's what DICE started as. They started as ATUC, I'm pretty sure, and moved from there. And they went from being no one to a powerhouse very fast. They had a bunch of big bad boys, and they were doing great. They had great leadership. And yeah, they just grew in a matter of months from nothing to someone big and shiny and powerful.
Right. They considered themselves princes of the universe, they said. I talked with a few of them yesterday and recorded it, and I'll put it out as supplemental material to this. But ATUC did become Destructive Influence, which is my corporation in NC. But how did Destructive Influence get involved, Bob?
They became involved crap. If I could remember, I think it was from a small corporation that actually flew up along in the north. If I could remember the name, it started with a small corporation that merged into ATIC, I think, and then ATIC came back and went away and came back and went away, and yeah.
Well,
That's how it started.
yeah, those are hard details to remember 10 years, 12 years later. But eventually DICE, I imagine, was hanging around with for a while because they actually became part of Band of Brothers, right?
Yeah, they did. So we started with Reikoku and Blacklight Corporation, which was damn it. Oh, I'm getting old.
Black was it Black
Black
Nova?
Nova.
Black
Black-
Nova.
Yeah. And Evolution, and that was it. And then Mu joined, but not properly in the alliance for a short while. And then we had another small corporation that was inside as well for a short while. And then ATIC or DICE came on later on.
Hmm. And I heard that Evolution plus Mu equaled Movevolution, which was a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a thing. That was before the alliance as such was started, and we had an informal alliance, as in Reikoko, Black Nova, and Evolution, and then we threw Mu into the mix, and everyone went, "Yikes! That's just gonna be stupid."
Right. So you had some of the most cutting edge pirates along with Evolution, which was a juggernaut at the time. So you guys went into the Pendulum War that led to the Titans being developed in the South with Ascendant Frontier, and that whole chapter of Bob's legacy. So, Andrew, do you want to kind of set up what the Pendulum Wars were and maybe how they relate to the ASCN?
Sure. Yeah. The Pendulum Wars, as they've been described to me by Molly, were basically about a scheme to create content for Band of Brothers and Evolution down in Delve, which was their headquarters at the time in this is 2005. And I'm telling Molly's story for him, but basically the idea was to go up into the north, piss a bunch of people off, kick the hornet's nest, and then retreat back down to Delve. And then they would come attack you in Delve, and you wouldn't have to fly all the way up to the north to get them to come attack you. You could get them to sort of you could bait them into coming into your home territory, and you'd have all this content. You wouldn't have to go anywhere. And so the idea was, Molly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea was to be kind of like a pendulum, and it would go up into the north, and they would hit somebody, and then they would come back down, and then they would go into the east and hit Ascendant Frontier, and then they would come back, and then that's kind of spiraled out of control into the broader Ascendant Frontier War, where it became sort of a full-on, all-out conflict between Band of Brothers and Ascendant Frontier. How'd I do?
How did that start with Ascendant Frontier?
Well, so that conflict gets started because Ascendant Frontier builds the first Titan in EVE Online's history. And good old Steve the Titan. And
sounds like Bruce the Shark, right, from Jaws.
Yeah, so Steve the Titan gets built after months and months of preparation and scheming and trying to keep things secret, and it finally is birthed, and everybody wants to destroy the thing, and immediately. And I believe that was one of the main impetuses that set off the campaign against Ascendant Frontier, was the desire to kill Steve the Titan.
Molly, can you still hear us?
Yeah.
How did I do?
So for the ASCN wars, you guys are breaking up a bit. The drive for us wasn't really to kill Steve. That kind of came as a bonus, but that wasn't the drive. The Pendulum Wars was all about, as Andrew said, yeah, we're going to get fights to our doorstep. So first, we're going to go up north. We're going to kick the biggest, baddest guy up there, whoever it is, in the butt as far as we can, and then we're going to go home. And then we're going to go to the east, and we're going to go kick the biggest, baddest guy on that side in the butt as hard as we can, and then we're going to go home. But what happened is when we went over to ASCN and started kicking them, they started folding. And we were not counting on that whatsoever.
Oh. So your intent wasn't to crush them or break them.
No, that was not the intent. But as we came up there and started kicking them, they started folding, and we could see that they were breaking. So it just spiraled from there, and eventually we got to Steve as well and got rid of him. So yeah, hey, win-win.
That's right. You killed the Titan. The first Titan built was also the first Titan to die.
It was.
Yeah,
What was
the thing about that is that it wasn't just the fact that Band of Brothers was in there kicking them. It was also, there was a lot of, as I alluded to earlier, there was a lot of like forum war stuff going on. And the forum war stuff was, as usual, very, very, Molly was being Molly, and it was very much, we're here to, like take your women and kill your babies. And when you had something like that going, it has an effect on the people that you're fighting. So even though ASCN might have been able to stand or not fall apart, they were probably pretty much convinced that, the end was nigh, and that had a cascading effect. And so that was, I don't know. Molly says he was surprised that they folded, but maybe he shouldn't have been.
Well, they had tons and tons and tons of resources. They had tons and tons of people. By any measuring standard, we should not have been able to break them, because we had, 1,000 people at the most, and they had, 7,000? That math doesn't ring true in any way. And it just started happening, and we just kept on going. And yeah, okay, let's do it.
And you got a Titan kill the first out of it, which kind of ended the career of Sivok, who was their leader.
I think that Sivok quitting was probably the straw that broke him. I know that he tried turning it over to a couple of guys to keep the fight going, but Sivok was, he was ASCN. And when he lost that Titan and he pulled and he just said, I'm done, I think that was probably the big thing. ASCN as an entity, definitely could have kept the good fight going, but they just, without Sivok to hold them together, it just didn't work.
Yeah, it's an interesting quality of a lot of different organizations that you come across in the history, where once in a while you'll find these groups where they're entirely dependent on their main leader. And if that main leader quits, it's just done. There's nobody else who's even capable of keeping the whole thing together. I haven't personally researched this, but I think that was sort of the case with Atlas Alliance as well, where Bobby Atlas at the head of this corporation stops, taking quite such an active role in what's going on, and it all kind of falls apart. And the ASCN is very much the same story, where Sivok leaves, and then Sivok essentially rage quits rage quits all of Eve after Steve the Titan is destroyed, and then there's just nobody guiding it's cutting the head off of the organism, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, Carneros.
Yeah, so not long after Steve the Titan came along Darwin's Contraption. And I imagine it was hard to know exactly in those days, but was that the second Titan built, or was that just the second famous Titan?
That was the second Titan. So Steve was built, I think it was 2 weeks before ours popped out of the oven. And yeah, that was kind of miscalculation. We did not know that they were working on the first one and how far along they were. So we were counting on having the first one. But yeah, as it turns out, we didn't. We got the second one.
And I'm going to assume that your famous Titan pilot Shrike was flying Darwin's Contraption.
Yes, I was.
And in those days, trust worked differently in Eve than it does today. And you guys are famous with your tight-knit group and and I'm wondering, how long did you have Darwin's Contraption before you let another pilot sit in him?
Never. So
holy cow!
Now, way back then, you actually had people sharing accounts a lot, because they had a specific account set up for a very specific job. So sharing accounts was a thing back then. I don't think it is so much today. It could be, but I got slapped on my fingers for doing that with a battleship pilot. So in the end, I could not share my account even if I wanted to, and even if I trusted someone, because everyone was looking at me. And I was getting petitioned like every other day as in, hey, this guy is account sharing, please ban him. So yeah, there was only ever me, Flying Shrike, and no one else ever.
So, Celine, you also had a Titan. What was its name?
Armageddon Dawn.
All right, these are two of the first Titans in the game, right? You guys are two of the first Titan pilots.
No, I think that I believe Molly's was the second. I believe mine was the 6th or the 7th, and I believe, the second Ragnarok.
Right. Well, you're in the top 10, which if you look around now, that's good. You were flying them when they were expensive and dangerous and a coveted target as well. So the risk factor was huge. And you didn't have a bunch of other supers that were going to be able to, give you cap or defend you, that kind of stuff.
That's your fit was really unique, right?
Yeah, when we got to the point where we could throw a Titan together, we specifically went for a very different type of mechanic. Instead of, Molly and Thug and these other guys had gone with avatars and Erebuses, which they were like putting, like double and triple reps on and super tanking. And part of the mystique of flying they used to call super carriers motherships, but part of the mystique of flying one of these ships was that they were so new and so unfamiliar that people didn't really understand what their full capabilities were or were not. So what we decided to do was we went in an entirely different direction. We made a Minmatar Titan that had polys in the rigs, inertial stabs in the lows, and the entire purpose of a Titan, as far as we were concerned, had nothing to do with staying on a field and doing anything, because it had no damage bonuses to the guns or anything. The most important thing a Titan could do, aside from using a jump portal, was the Doomsday device, the area of effect Doomsday device that could do 60 or 70,000 points of damage to everything within 250 kilometers. And so get it on grid, get it off grid as quickly as possible. So we made a Titan that could warp in, hit the button, and warp off in less than 9 seconds.
Wow.
Well, and there were other variations of this as well. We got the idea off of watching actually one of the old Northern Coalition Leviathans. There was a guy named Overon, I believe was his name, in the old Northern Coalition coalition of alliances up in the north. He made a Leviathan that was nothing but like cap recharge, and he could jump in, hit his DD, and jump out within 12 seconds. So there was no mechanic that stopped the ship once you hit the DD. There was no limitations whatsoever. You couldn't be caught by bubbles, nothing. So these were two examples of fairly ridiculous and retarded fits that we were using back in the day before CCP caught up with the players again.
So you didn't do a lot of changing your fit up all the time, experimenting, because you had something that you theory crafted through and it was working for you. Is that right?
So the role for Celine was totally different from my role, because Celine, they had a job as mercenaries to actually execute whatever. So Celine's roles was to go in and do as much damage as possible, whereas my role was more deterrent. I'm going to go and sit on the battlefield, blow out a Doomsday, and look scary, and I'm going to be staying on the battlefield until it's time to leave and we have won the battle.
And did you change Darwin's contraptions fit a lot and experiment a lot as you were going and learning how to use it?
Nope. So my role has never been the ship tinker. I couldn't set up a Titan if I wanted to today.
That's interesting. Because again, you were one of the first Titan pilots, probably the first Titan to intimidate.
I think what Molly's touching on there is something that's kind of, some some fleet commanders, some alliance leaders, they sit in the theory crafting channel with all of their other math nerds, and they go through, oh my God, we need an 8% chart. No. There's quite a few of us that, okay, I've got this thing. What do I do with it? Okay, good. I'll do that. And that's, that was kind of what happened with me as well. We had this idea that we wanted to do something different, and we had a group of people that, well, actually, it was 3 guys that came up with this, this radical idea, and said, okay, this is how you're going to fit it, and this is how you're going to fly it, and it actually worked. Holy shit, So that's just what we kept on doing.
I want to talk about Shrike a little bit, because Shrike is obviously Sir Mole's combat alt, and I guess Sir Mole was the one making speeches on the first, but Shrike is really work. But you were also, and this is amazing, the champion for House Sarum in the first Succession trials, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
How did that come about? Tell us about that. How did you find your way there?
So that was actually a team effort. So CCP created the first tournament before all the crazy stuff with the Alliance tournament, and we were part of signing up for it, and wasn't that much people, and even back in that day, and there was a tournament with 4 people on each team, and you had very specific ships that you could use, as in you are allowed to use frigates only, you're allowed to use Tech 1 only, Tech 2 didn't exist back then, you can use faction, and that was it. So we just took 4 of our best people and went nuts.
Wow. And you did very well. I think you almost won. But the guy from... What's that?
There is no such thing as almost winning.
You're right. Do or do not, says Yoda. So you didn't do it. The guy from Corazor won, but your house became queen anyway, or empress.
Yep.
How did you feel about that?
We were never role players. I have no clue how we...
Didn't matter. Okay.
We did have one guy sneak into the succession ceremonies with a fully loaded APOC, though, and going nuts on the newly appointed emperor, trying to kill it before the GMs killed him. But that's a different story.
Okay. Because people think of Sir Mole and Band of Brothers as this juggernaut of player activity in Nullsec, but what they don't realize is you guys were all dominating the Alliance tournament first dynasty, which is the first 3 years, and you were in the middle of lore. You played a pivotal role in lore for a pivotal house. So there's just lots of different strains of how you were moving through the game. All right. Anything else on this?
Yeah, it's just part of creating content for your people, because as a leader, that's what you're going to have to do. Create content for people to come and log in and enjoy themselves. That's all you do.
Yeah. By the way, did you get any ships for that tournament?
Yes, we did. We got a bunch of silver magnets.
So do you still have those, or did those get killed somewhere?
And we got a total of 4 of those, and we got a Imperial Armageddon as well. I think First Corps, which was known back then as Homo erectus, killed 2 of the silver magnets by being stupid, as he always is. And the Imperial Armageddon we sold for insane money when we needed money for something like paying MC, I think it was.
Paying Mercenary Coalition.
Yep.
All right. So Mercenary Coalition and Band of Brothers are kind of synonymous with one another because you work together a lot. You remain they were very effective for you, especially in the then in the middle of, I wouldn't say the middle, I'm not that sure on the details. Actually, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong. There's this thing called Tortuga. Do you want to describe what that is, Andrew, or?
Yeah, I mean, Celine can obviously do a way better job than I can, but Tortuga was essentially kind of like a mercenary power block in period basis that was forged during the middle of the second stage of the Great War, if I'm not mistaken, as sort of a place for mercenary to go, mercenary coalition to go and have a place to call its own. I'd have to get a refresher on the history of that, and luckily we have Celine.
Yeah, I wonder who we could ask.
So if my brain fart can be healed, it's by Celine.
So this is really easy. I can sum this up in just a couple of sentences. I mean, there's a lot more to tell, but basically, Tortuga was a really good idea at a really bad time. That's the essence of it at its easiest. Now, the other piece of this is that Tortuga was kind of this brainstorm idea from a lot of different guys from within MC at the time, who were dissatisfied with the way things were, the relationship was with Band of Brothers and everything else, and they wanted to do a few different things. I at the time had been working at CCP for almost a year, and one of the conditions back then that was they didn't freeze your account, they didn't do anything, but they did say that if you get to a point in EVE where you're too well known or too this or too that, then you're going to have to look at making a choice between your job and the game. And so I had reached that point where I was literally being told that I had to make this choice. So I was trying to step away as much as I possibly could. And some shit had gone sour, and then there were a couple of different ideas. One of the bigger ideas, and the one that I kind of liked the most, was let's just drop everything and let's go back up to the north and let's kick, I believe it was Triumvirate, who was in Decline, or Declan, or however you want to pronounce it. And let's go up there and let's set up shop up there. And then we can make up our minds from that point forward. Do we stay the path and do we keep on going, alongside Band of Brothers, or do we just cut ourselves off completely, or what? But there was another group in the alliance that had it in their head that, like, no, we really want to just completely change things. We like where we are. We don't want to move. Bob's already gonna die. So let's just cut the fucking cord and go all out. And those voices kind of won out because I was literally like 3 weeks from having my accounts almost deactivated. And the guy I had turned the alliance over to essentially to run, I was like within 2 or 3 weeks of turning it over to him officially, he got very sick in real life. And yet all of these machinations and all of these preparations had been made. So from like within 1 or 2 days, I got from being at a point where I thought I was done, I thought I was going to be able to step away, to being told, no, someone's got to step in. And of course, no one in MC and no one, and like maybe only like 5 people in EVE even had a clue that I was working at CCP. So it was either I had to step in and take things from that point, or drop the whole thing, and then everybody would know that was weird and that I was working at the company, and that would have been a giant shitstorm back then. So I ended up basically getting back in and fighting, I guess, a conflict or a war that my heart wasn't completely in. And I don't really want to say one way or the other, things could have turned out differently. Things could have been this or that. But as things progressed and as things got, to where they were, I eventually got to a point where I was like, I, number one, can't play because the company didn't want me to play anymore. And number two, I wasn't particularly happy with it in the first place. So I shut the alliance down about 4 or 5 months later. The writing was already on the wall. Bob had already kind of held the line and was turning the tide. And so I shut everything down. And I even said in the post that, that where I shut the alliance down, that I wasn't pleased with the way that it had gone. So yeah, and that was that. And it was shut down for better part of 8 or 9 years until a friend of mine convinced me to start it back up a couple of years ago. So that's kind of the inside story of what happened. You could talk for quite a while about the in-game events that actually took place, which were quite dramatic and quite interesting. But yeah, that's most of where it came from.
Yeah, you could make a really great war movie about Tortuga. Just sort of like this, side story that takes place in the midst of huge things that are happening in the rest of the universe. There's this incredible story of mercenaries like trying to figure out how to survive in the rest in this sort of new Eve universe and figure out the new role and all there. I mean, there's so many like huge like climactic battles that just you didn't have space to go into every single one of them in Empires of Eve, but like they're there like kind of lurking beneath the surface. If you go and do the research on that stuff, there's some incredible like last stand fights and climactic last moments. It's a really amazing story.
Yeah, it was painful. It really was. There was a lot that was going on at that time, and there was so much happening, and it was. I have very bad memories of that time for a lot of different reasons. There was some really amazing fights that took place as a result of it, but I was. Yeah, it was a rough Christmas. Let me put it that way.
you and Sir Mole haven't really spoken since.
Well, there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think that we've talked a couple of times here and there over the years. But
you're sugarcoating. You're sugarcoating for me.
Oh, I'm sure I am. There's
blow the sugar coating off that.
Let's put this into perspective because MC and Bob, we were tight. MC was our brother. They were doing a lot of stuff for us. Sometimes they would bill us as we would have to pay. Other times, hey, let's just say you paid, etc. So MC was doing a bunch of dirty works for Bob, like tons and tons and tons, and they were very, very successful. In the end, we carved out a piece of space for them, as in, hey, go live here and keep on doing what you're doing. And we were best buddies. Then from one day to the other, everything turned. And this is what Celine is speaking about.
Yep.
And he stepped away, and then all of a sudden, MC became something totally different. And Tortuga, etc., blah, blah, was working with Bob for a bit, not that very long. I'm not sure how long, but they were still doing Bob's biddings, as in, okay, we're going to go attack this. Can you guys go do this? So we distract enemies from doing whatever needs to be done. And it was a perfect relationship. As in fighting terms, we could take our massive force of Bob one direction. We could send MC to do whatever needs to be done on the back end line, say in the enemy space, and get things done. And then all of a sudden, more or less without warning, and in one day, they flipped. As in, we are no longer friends with Bob. We are going to start shooting Bobs. You are our enemies, Bob. And that hit everyone, every single one within Bob. And that one day is like, what the hell just happened? And why did it happen? So yeah, Selena's sugarcoating because we got pissed off. We got like so pissed off. And I have never heard the backstory before. This is the first time I've ever heard the backstory. Thanks, Celine.
Well,
Give some insight on what actually was going on because we could never figure out why. So we went from best buddies to natural born enemies, like tooth and claw, everything you had, the kitchen sink in one day.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, I mean, I don't mean to sugarcoat the events that happened. No, it was fucked up. I even publicly acknowledged what happened, and it's something that stuck with me quite a long time because shortly after I closed MC, I probably didn't really play Eve properly for the next couple of years as I was still at the company, but the whole way that went down was if I'd been able to stay at the helm, it wouldn't have happened like that, or it possibly wouldn't have happened at all. And I don't make any excuses for what did happen. What happened. And as Andrew said, yes, it makes for great story and all these other things. But it's something that I've tried to make sure that anytime I'm ever faced with a situation like that again in the virtual world, I've definitely tried to make sure that I have my hand firmly on the wheel and don't give it away, because it's a prime example of what happens whenever it does. But no, as I said, it was a rough Christmas. I was personally affected by the way that relationship broke down. I was not happy about it at all. So, don't think that there was any glee involved in it, at least from my end. There might have been from some of my members, but I was not exactly pleased with it. But it is what it is.
Very interesting. And so moving on to Bob and their struggle with goons, because we're wrapping up the show in 15 minutes. This was and continues to be kind of the central theme of conflict in EVE Online. It's like the dividing line. So do you want to tell us how you saw goons when they first appeared and why you were so mad at them?
Well, the goons were kind of like nothing back then. They were not sure what to call it, but the dirty kid on the street corner trying to be tough and speaking crap, and they were basically trying to be assholes to everyone, and they were exploiting stuff. They built overlays on the client and stuff like that. So we kind of just shrugged them off. They weren't anything back then, and it took a long time for them to actually become something. What eventually tipped them going public on their forums about a guy that died in our alliance, and they were making fun of him and how he died. I know that's real life stuff and shouldn't really be part of a game, but that ticked off a bunch of people, and that's when we said, okay, hey, let's go kill these guys because they're assholes.
Right.
So I just want to say one thing. It is kind of interesting because when goons first showed up, I think that a lot of the initial reaction was not really hostile. They were kind of a curiosity. There was like all these brand new players, and it wasn't really seen, at least like from my point of view, they weren't really seen as a threat or anything bad. They had a slightly different attitude, but then it did seem like over the course of a few weeks that really changed, and then the incident that Molly's talking about happened, and instead of being like other groups, and granted, goons have changed a lot over the years, but back then, instead of kind of like stepping up and saying like, oh, well, that was fucked up, we're sorry, they kind of embraced it, and they kind of seemed like they wanted to take this bad boy, edgy attitude, and shit just kind of exploded from there.
Yeah, I mean, there was no accountability for them at the time because they didn't have any ambition. And that's one of the reasons why people like kind of took a liking to them at first, was because it was just sort of like, hey, here's this different kind of person who now exists in EVE, and everybody was like, whoa, a new character that kind of like showed up in this story, and they're not ambitious, they're not trying to take over the game world, they're not necessarily challenging the power structure right away, and so there was kind of like a live and let live scenario where it was just sort of, here's some people we think are like kind of funny. And then once the politics get involved, it becomes a messier situation.
Well, to the establishment, it kind of sounds like they would have been something of a bacteria or a virus, like not really another being, but just kind of something that you would need to brush off because you got it on you, kind of thing.
That's kind of what they were, because I mean, we started a campaign against them. Evolution, and I think Bob was involved as well. Yeah, Bob was involved. And we went to their home space with the intent of wipe them out. And we stayed for a week, and there was nothing left. And from that, I was more or less, okay, we're done. Let's go. And that's, I think, where everything is coming from, or where it started. Because, okay, from that, they took the bad boy and just grew and ran with it.
Andrew, what do you think the secret to their success was? But or maybe that was the success. How did they grow from that little insignificant thing to something that was powerful enough to wage its own war?
Well, I think about that a lot because I'm very, very fascinated by goons and goon history in EVE because of that factor, because of how quickly they grew and how and the strength of the social organizations are very, very fascinating things, regardless of the fact that it takes place in the video game or virtual world. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is that bacteria or viral image that you expanded upon a moment ago, because any organization in EVE any organization at all needs like an explanation for how their group functions. Like you need to be able to communicate to a single person why they should continue to be part of the grander whole of the organization, why they should believe that being a part of this organization makes them stronger than they would be on their own, makes their individual actions count for more. And what Goons came up with was the image of the virus. And I always find this so fascinating because it's sort of uniquely suited to Eve and the internet, because each individual is kind of like an individual cell, but put together, they're part of something larger. And you want to create some kind of an image where a person feels like if they put in 1 unit of effort, they'll get 2 units of reward back, because they were part of the grander whole. And so being a part of the swarm, being a virus, it hits on the idea that everybody in Goons at the time knew that they individually sucked, but that being a part of this grander whole, it helped them understand why it didn't matter that they weren't as good one-on-one as one of their enemies. The swarm is the same image, and that kind of imagery, that storytelling, it has been a huge strength of Goons. And that understanding of how to frame things for the individual person, I think is a huge part of their success. And they do it in their propaganda, they do it in their posting, their speeches, all this kind of stuff. They're very focused on making the individual feel confident and feel sort of welcome and have a place in the larger whole.
Yep.
Well, a couple of the points of in your book where I actually laughed out loud, quotes from Matani, I think, who said, and I work with him, and he is a funny guy. He said something like, "When I first met these Russians, they sounded like 2 aliens from the planet Murder." It's just so colorful, the language.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's part of it too. Is having that sort of like blue collar attitude and a down to earth way of speaking just resonated with people in the modern era of the internet more than the old school role play stuff that people had never really had an experience with in modern Eve. New players from the new era of the internet were coming into that, and they had never heard stuff like that before, and they're like, well, who are these nerds who are trying to like rule the galaxy? And then here comes the Goons, and like, oh, this makes sense to me. This is what power looks like on the internet. I understand this. Like, I'm going to follow this.
Interesting how power looks like on the internet.
I've got hours worth of thoughts on that particular subject. If you want to do a different show,
we'll talk offline. I got to hear all your stuff. The other thing they said that was funny was they got a Titan too, but they didn't call Bruce Bruce or Bob, or they called it the Goon Cannon, which I thought was kind of funny. But these guys become, over time, through either luck or perseverance or a whole new evolution of leveraging motivation, a powerful force, and then they get lucky. Sir Mully, you want to take us to like how you felt when you were basically betrayed by one of the directors that was inside of Band of Brothers?
Right. That's a good one. How I felt? I have no clue. That was more, I got the news one morning waking up. This is what happened. And then everyone is all over the place trying to figure out what to do, how to do, and how to get it sorted. And I mean, we knew kind of quickly who it was, but we didn't really get a motivation on why it was done. But basically, they tore down everything we had built in the last couple of years as an infrastructure in 2 minutes, thanks to a faulty game mechanic, I would say. But hey, that's what it is. And at that point, we were the big bad guy everyone wanted to kill. And we had set ourselves up to be the big bad boy that everyone wants to kill. It's just that at this moment, everything fell apart and everyone got the opportunity to come on our doorstep where we had no infrastructure left, nothing whatsoever. We had to start from scratch. And basically, the whole of Eve just converged on us where we were, which is fine, which is what we were looking for. But we had planned to be a little bit more defensive and actually being able to do something. So that was rough. That was very rough. But hey, that's the game.
Well, it must have sucked because here you had just successfully defended Delve with Fortress Delve, right? And you guys were still very powerful. You could fend off a lot of people. But here you kind of got unplugged.
Yeah, that broke down 90% of our defenses in one stroke. In 1 minute, it was done. And yeah, we had to do what we could do, but in the end, there wasn't that much we could do. We could delay everything, but there was no way we were going to be able to pull that one off.
Yeah. So it was funny because when I was watching, there was a guy who was one of the announcers, the broadcasters, and he looks at the camera and it's just got a blank look on his face and saying, apparently my alliance has just been disbanded. Like that happened in the middle of a lot of people watching. So it was a very present moment for a lot of people because they were all gathered watching in those days, you couldn't just see a streamer. There was a streamer. It's a big deal to be watching the Alliance tournament. But to this day, like how do you actually view Goon Swarm and what they've done with the game? Or, it's been a long time, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on them as an entity.
Well, goons are always going to be my enemy because, in my view, they are still assholes. So they're always going to be my enemy. It's good for the game to have a common enemy to turn against. I just wish that those guys would actually stand up and fight more instead of running away every single time they stand up or get attacked. It's bad for the game that it's those people. Could be someone else who would actually stand up and fight. And yeah, I don't like them.
I could just stop right there. That's like cut podcast over.
There's this really amazing YouTube video out there that you can actually just go look at for yourself, where it's one probably like a 2008 barbecue, and Mully's, I think he actually has the pink cowboy hat on. I'm not sure about that.
They've been showing it during the stream.
Oh, really? Okay. It was everybody's seen it, but for people on the call who haven't, he's smoking a cigar, and somebody that's holding the camera says, like, send a message to goons, and he takes a big long drag off the cigar, and he's like, die.
Oh, man. Both times.
All right. Thank you for that. Let's kind of wrap up. I don't think we get a better end than that, but I do want to give Celine a chance to say anything about that era. You were probably gone from the game, right? You were probably at CCP at the time.
Yeah, from about mid 2008 until about 2011, I was still playing. I mean, I was still doing stuff, as best, as much as I could, probably a bit more than folks would realize. But I was pretty much out of it. I didn't really step back into EVE properly until about, I don't know, spring, summer 2011, whenever my corp joined PL. And prior to that, no, it was, I kept my hand in, kept aware of things that were going on, but I wasn't playing an active part in any of it.
Now, we've only covered a section of history. A lot of it is based on the fine work that Andrew did. But there's a lot more history out there, and but where are you guys now, Celine? You're back in the game.
Yeah. January, a year or two ago, 2015, a friend of mine, guy named Saber A, who's got his own history in EVE. He was tired of doing things a certain way, and he kind of came and spent a week asking me if he could, because I'd kept MC on ice and never thought about doing anything with it again, really. But he convinced me to try and give it a shot, and I was half a foot out again, not really paying as much attention to EVE as I normally would have. And I gave him the keys, said, start it back up, see, when it crashes and burns, let me know. And and it didn't. He actually managed to get things rolling fairly well, and a couple corps joined up, things got a little better, and then and then World War B kicked off, and then this is Saber again, kind of had us involved in the forefront of that. And of course, big war, steady content. I screwed up and started playing again, and one thing led to another. And here about 6 or 7 months ago, he decided to retire from EVE and officially handed the reins back over to me again. So now I'm running my old alliance and playing far, far more than any sane person should. But it's the people. I still enjoy the people. I enjoy going to the events and talking to people and doing stuff like this as well. So yeah.
And Sir Molly, you're an NC. You're not very visible. I think you only talk your
Oh.
ship or something.
So I went back to being active more or less in Evolution and NC Dog up until I would say the BR Dash massive 14 hours battle took place. And that's kind of where I realized, okay, as much fun as this is, I can't do 14-hour battles anymore. I am way too old. I got way too many kids and I got a family. So I'm just going to take on the grandpa role. Evolution is doing fine, still focusing on the people more than what they have or what skill points they have. And we're part of NC Dot, which is the perfect home for Revolution. And we're a different beast today than we was way back then, because way back then we were a powerhouse on our own. And today we're only a powerhouse when it comes to being old, retired, rich people, I would say. But yeah, I'm still around, still following everything. Even if I'm not on the battlefield, I am probably somewhere in Jita making money.
And you did, like I did say earlier, show 2015, we're taking out a pause in Iridia, and that was a real thrill.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Do you approve of NC Dot and how they're managing things, and basically the landscape of Eve is going?
Landscape of Eve needs to be shaken up. It's too crystallized. There needs to be more than two entities. Right now you have the Goon side and you have the PLNC Dot side, and that's it. And you basically got red versus blue, and you need to have a little bit more on that color spectrum. You need to have 5, 6, 7 different entities who are all capable of actually fighting, because it's too few people are deciding the content for a very lot of people.
Right. That's a good point.
And it's a lot of work for those few people.
Yeah. As a leader in Eve, you are dedicating your life to Eve. Otherwise, you are not a leader in Eve. So it's your choice if you want to do it. But I've been there, I've done that, and I'm happy where I'm at.
So this is the last point. I heard that you said, I already won Eve. I found my wife playing Eve.
Yeah, 100% correct. I left Sweden in 2010, moved over to the US, and I married a Eve player, and we are still married.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. Well, this has been a treat. We should do it again if we can. Love to hear more of this stuff. We really only covered part of it, and we didn't even get into the details and stuff. But it's been a real treat for me as a player of Eve, and I think for the audience that will be hearing this. So thank you guys very much.
Thanks so much. This was awesome.
Yeah, it was good. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carneros, Andrew, Celine, and Sir Molly for giving us this great show that we put out today. Thank you, audience, for showing up today. I want to thank Wolf Glenn again for tipping $50. Thank you so much. And the guys that have subscribed, Kane for 29 months of subscription. Really appreciate all this stuff. Thank you, guys. They're listening to the podcast. Again, you can support at Patreon/Matterall. And I can't be thankful enough that Sir Mole decided to join us with Andrew. I think it was out of respect for Andrew that he decided to do this show. You should know that. Otherwise, it's a very rare appearance, and we're very lucky to have been able to have this happen. So thanks, guys, very much. That is all this week. We will see you next week on Talking in Stations.